Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 854th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege today of being your MC for a conversation featuring Beatriz Cortez and Chloe Stagaman. We're also thrilled to welcome poet Laura Jaramillo here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter, and here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Beatriz Cortez is a multidisciplinary artist based in Los Angeles. Her work explores simultaneity, different temporalities, and speculative imaginaries of the future. She currently has solo exhibitions at Storm King Art Center in New York and Williams College Museum of Art. She has received the Latinx Artist Fellowship and the Borderlands Fellowship, among many others. She holds an MFA from the California Institute of the Arts and is currently Associate Professor of Art at UC Davis. And our host today is the Brooklyn Rail's Director of Programs, Chloe Stagaman. Chloe is a curator working with artists in public spaces. Prior to her time at the Rail, Chloe was a public curator in London, where she collaborated with artists to deliver site-specific commissions, artist in residence programs, and cultural partnerships in the US and the UK. She has an MA in art history with a focus on documentary photography and contemporary art from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. It is such an honor to have you both here in conversation on the NSE today. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Chloe.
Thank you so much, Eleanor, and thanks so much to my team at the Rail, who I love working with and who I'm very lucky to work with. And thank you to Beatriz for doing this interview today. Hi, Beatriz, how are you?
Hi, Chloe. Thank you so much, Eleanor. And I'm doing great. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm really excited about this conversation.
Yeah, so it's such a pleasure to be in dialogue with you. We're here today to talk about a current exhibition that you have on view at Storm King Art Center in New Windsor, New York, called The Volcano That Left. And I'm going to pull the exhibition on screen so that everyone can see it, especially those of you who haven't had a chance to see it in person yet. I certainly encourage you to do so. It's on view through November 13th, and we'll see many seasons. Beatriz, I want to talk first. I guess an apt starting point is when Eric Booker, the associate curator at Storm King, called you with the opportunity for the commission at Storm King. Where were you, both in the process of thinking about these works that are on view, but also geographically, where were you, and how did that conversation begin and result in the works that we're seeing broadly at Storm King?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that, you know, a work of art is always a process and part of what you're thinking about for sometimes years. And the three works that are in the show, two of them are new. The Volcano and also the Stella are new, and the Stella was made for this show, for this exhibition, and the Volcano was finished just before this exhibition opened. But I was already in the process of making this Volcano because I had been thinking a lot about the eruption of Ilopango as a moment when the planet was able to cool itself and stop global warming. When the first pandemic also happened, etc. And so that was really a really important thing for me. And I began thinking a lot about this eruption that impacted the whole planet and that spread the particles of the Earth from the underworld in what is now Central America, all over the planet. And so I first made two other stellas that tell the story of the migration of the particles and the migration of people over the particles. And then I began to work on this volcano while I was in residence at Atelier Calder in Sachet in France. And that was a work that was enabled by that residency and also by a commission from the MPAC, the Experimental Media and Performance Art space at RPI, and the place where the Volcano will travel to from Storm King. And so I was working with Vic Brooks, a curator there, and she had commissioned this work. The work was, slowly taking shape. These are some images of us installing the frames of the Volcano in the esplanade in front of Atelier Calder. And so then at that moment, I met Eric and told him about this project. And Eric then became also a crucial voice and a crucial conversation for me as I was working on the final stages of this project with the team. Here you see the team at the studio. I believe that they're here. So hello, there's Tatiana sticking her head out from the Volcano on the left, and Philip is in the middle. And Ricardo, you can't see his face because he's underneath the top of the Volcano in the interior. But I took this photo of them because I think it's also important how this work came to being through the labor of the four of us working, with MIG welders, yes, but also low technology like beating the metal over, with round ball hammers over sacks of sand, and placing the pieces in the air and saying, improvising the lines. This line needs to go this way, this line needs to go that way, etc. And so I think the making the Volcano was also an adventure that was full of joy, although at the end we were so tired. Full of joy because it was always fun to see how it was taking shape and see it emerge from those frames. And there was so much that was also a space for each of the artists to also improvise into the frames that I had improvised in making. And so making all those together was really great and fun. And we worked together in Los Angeles making it. And then later at Storm King, we were there in residence for about a week or 10 days before the show opened and worked there too.
Yeah, it's really amazing to behold in person in its finished form at Storm King. And there are so many details that I want to get into with you about the work. But I want to start with this view, which has both Cosmic Mirror, the sky over New York, which is the work that sort of, in my view, when I was seeing the work, really places the three works where they are. They sit right outside of Storm King's museum building. And Cosmic Mirror is a series of 11 boulder-like structures. And they look towards the sky and they appear right in the middle of a clearing of trees where they have this unobstructed view of what's above them. And they sit right beside Ilopango, the volcano, and they seem to be immediately in conversation about what is above and what is below, which is something that is often happening in your work. And I wonder if you can talk a bit about that and these two works, and then we'll zero in on Ilopango a little bit.
Yeah, for me, this work is also a conversation about ancient forms of abstraction because I have always been fascinated by the idea that in ancient times, there were other modernities, there were other developments, scientific developments, knowledge that was so precise that sometimes some of it we don't have now. And there was the ability for abstraction. And so a piece like this evokes that form of abstraction that can be found, for example, in the work of the ancient Olmec, who in the site of La Venta is where we have found this, but I'm sure there were other sites that we don't know yet about. But in the site of La Venta, the Olmec would lay out large mosaics that they would bury or place over the landscape, and they were too large for humans to perceive from our own scale. And so one can walk around them, they can feel almost like a labyrinth, but they don't, you don't see them. In order to see them, you have to look at the layout and imagine having a bird's eye view. And given that the Olmec probably didn't have drones and didn't have satellite view, then it means that they had the ability 2,900 years ago to imagine being other, to imagine being in the cosmos, to imagine the view from there, and to create these designs that were messages to the cosmos or were messages to the gods and had spiritual meaning, but also these intellectual and conceptual meaning. And so that to me is really interesting. And I think that this constellation to me is also really interesting because I remember it over the sky, in the sky over San Salvador. I remember it in my childhood, and that's really fun for me because I think that looking at a constellation might mean that we're looking at something that has different names and maybe different meanings in different cultures. But, we're looking at a constellation that in the time of King Pakal, there's an inscription in the Temple of Inscriptions that says that he was conceived under this constellation, when this constellation was in the sky above Palenque. So to me, the temporalities between us and King Pakal are so small compared to the millions of years that it takes for the light of a star to get here. And so they're so small that in reality, by looking at a star, we can just imagine changing our orientation, and then we could be in a different location. And we can imagine also that all of us are looking, we're forming a community. It's kind of like a time machine because we're forming a community looking at something at the same time. And so for me, this piece is also a game. It's a game of telling the cosmos, this is what you look like from here, sending a message into the cosmos where a conversation that's non-human because you're not speaking to a human, but to another being, another entity, etc.
I love that. I love that idea. I also feel like too, it really reads like an invitation to speculate, and an invitation to sort of embrace that which we can't immediately see, or that which maybe is for a site larger than that initial field of vision, which is a perfect transition to Ilopango itself, which is so, you talked about this with Eric Booker in a talk with Storm King about the risks associated with making a physical form in the shape of Ilopango after really reflecting so long on this volcano and having it so dear to your work and to your thinking. And, how did speculation breathe life into the sculpture and breathe life into the way you went about making it for Storm King?
I think that, in my experience, when I'm building a sculpture, if I just kind of eyeball things, or if I draw a line without being careful, my line is not so believable. Usually nature and the universe know best. And if I'm making a rock, like those rocks that are part of Cosmic Mirror, we actually went into the field and copied boulders that were actual boulders and made patterns as if we were making a dress with paper, etc. And oftentimes, I felt that there was something ironic because I of course I'm speculating there was no drawing of Ilopango that survived. So Ilopango erupted in the year 536, and its entire cone collapsed into a caldera, which became a lake. And when I was little, I remember the lake. I remember swimming in the lake, but I don't remember knowing that there was a volcano that was alive under the water, etc. And so I think there's something really interesting about speculating on the shape of a volcano, because I remember how I struggled and I walked and paced and paced and walked because I believe that defining one's identity as a little bit claustrophobic because it sets your identity as if it were part of the past and not, you know, in the process of becoming and part of the future. I didn't really feel so comfortable setting the shape of Ilopango in a static way when Ilopango in my imaginary kept changing and changing its shape. And I thought it has to be organic and it has to look like it's flowing and like it has motion. And so that's, you know, to the best of our ability, our effort to capture that motion. I also think that there's a lot of features of Ilopango that in many ways remind me of another volcano, which is closer to San Salvador, which is the volcano that I saw all the time when I opened the door from my house. It was there at the end of the street. You could see it. So every morning I would, you know, get up and go to school or whatever. And the volcano was there. It was it's the landscape that feels like home. And so I look at Ilopango and I see that other volcano from San Salvador as well in there, you know, and I see also this motion, and I love that about walking around Ilopango and seeing it change and transform itself. That's something that to me became really interesting once it was installed because, you know, when you're close to a volcano, you know that changing the way it looks takes driving quite a bit and moving quite a bit. And so here our relationship with the piece is such that we can walk around it. And yes, it takes maybe 5 minutes to walk around it, but we can change the way it looks very quickly. And so our relationship with this mountain is different than it is in on the landscape. And so I thought that's really interesting too. And so when making this piece, to me, it was important to imagine what it would look like from above, what would it look like from the sides, etc., and all that.
Yeah, and you can really feel that care in both the way the metal shapes are welded together and the welds are sort of left for us to digest as you walk around it. At times there are little gaps and spaces between the pieces of metal, letting air in and out, similar to that of a volcano. And there are all these seams that sort of indicate a sculpture in motion. And it is in motion. I mean, it came to Storm King already on 2 adventures. It went across the Atlantic Ocean. It went in a truck to Storm King from your studio, Building 5. So it really already left 2 locations for its current one. And I wonder, you know, there's so much to the craft of making each of these individual pieces. And, you know, into leaving it the way it is in terms of all of the work that went into the sculpture being immediately visible to the viewer. And I wonder if you could just say a few words on your thinking in that regard, because it's really something that I noticed right away. I remember when I first saw the photo of Ilopango, it immediately, like from far away, I thought that it was like rocks that had been tied together by pieces of string. And, you know, because it was like, that was where my mind went first. And then as I got closer to it and I could see the way that the rocks were undulating, it not only changed my relationship to the sculpture, but it changed the way I think about mountains in particular and the care and time with which nature brings mountains together. And so, yeah, I wondered if you could speak a bit about that process in your studio and that thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think a few years back when I was working on the exhibition that where we installed Glacial Erratic, another sculpture that I had at Rockefeller Center that was moved to a mountain. Part of the whole conceptual center of that exhibition was that mountains are on the move, that the landscape is on the move, that ancient peoples in Mesoamerica believe that there's a massive snake under the ground, that it's moving around. And when it moves, that's what creates the mountains. And in many ways, you know, we can think, oh, that's not possible, etc. But actually it makes all the sense in the world, because if you think of the landscape not from a human perspective, when from our perspective, it looks permanent and unmovable. The reality is that the landscape is on the move. And if we were able to install a stop motion camera that could be there for millions of years, we would be able to see the motion of the landscape. And so I love how there's so much of science in the content of the ancient forms of spirituality, and the idea of thinking of mountains on the move, which I see in the work of several other artists. And so I was really interested in this idea. And so for me, what was really interesting about making this work in this way is that the frames are really the skeleton of the sculpture. They're support, the frame that supports the sculpture. And to me, to leave those, to build them in a way that they are visible on the outside, instead of making a frame and scaffolding that lives on the inside, to make the frames be visible and be part of the sculpture was really one of the challenges of building this sculpture. And so that was what took us maybe more than 2 months, I would say almost 3 months, to build the frames in a way that we could then remove, install, and deinstall. And in fact, installing this is possible, but obviously, but it's not easy. You have to install it in a certain order, otherwise it doesn't work, because one piece has to release the other one, and then they lock themselves, lock each other. And so it's quite difficult to do. And I love that idea and that experience of making the pieces flow. But then after that, once we began covering the sections, each one of the frames, with the skin that turns the volcano, gives this weight to the volcano, then at that moment, we began working in the same way that we had worked in making the boulders that are all around it. And so each one of the frames allowed for some improvising, for some play, and for us to imagine different things. For example, I had designed the volcano in the back. It has an area that is basically where the lava is flowing at certain moment in its history, but by the time that we're looking at it, it's more like obsidian that has remained there, different shapes of obsidian in the back. And so if you look at the backside of the volcano, then you can see that there's these two rivers of these obsidian rivers flowing. All these things were designed, and so we knew which frame goes where, what kind of basic shape each one of the frames had. And if we were confused, we had to talk all the time with the team. Okay, let's go over this. And we would all make sure that nobody was confused, because we need to know which frame goes where and what's going to be in the way, because if you weld in the wrong place, we won't be able to assemble it anymore. And so all these things that we did, not in a design with ACAD, but just speaking out loud in the studio on a daily basis, was really interesting, because it required a lot of an intellectual effort on our part to keep track of how this was going to come together without seeing it. And so I love that too, because it was kind of like the abstraction of the ancient Olmec, but in a different way, And so it was really fun. At the same time, I love that there was room for each of the artists who work in my studio. Each one of them is so amazing. And and so talented and so committed to the work that we're making. And I love that there was room for each one of the frames. We know who made which frame and passed it at certain moment to somebody else. And so we know what decisions were made collectively, where things happened. And I love knowing those things. I love seeing it and knowing those things. It's really beautiful. And then there were other people who were not in the studio that were helping us. Other artists that came, and friends also that came to beat metal with round ball hammers and to help us advance faster, because the volcano got stuck in the middle of the strikes in France. And so it got here later than we would have loved to get it. And so we were trying to work really fast. And so a lot of people came, brought us food and beat metal and left. And it was beautiful to see all these collective labor working to make Ilopango emerge.
Wow, that's really beautiful. I mean, I think too, there's so much collective labor that has gone into the future of Ilopango as it leaves Storm King eventually and travels up the Hudson to MPAC in Troy, New York. And there will be programming around its moving. And it really feels like an opportunity where several institutions have banded together and partnered for the sake of the work. And I wonder if, you know, one of the things that I talked about with Eric and Adela when I was at Storm King was about the void that it will leave on the land when it's gone, and how there will be this lake there, you know, lake in the sense of Lake Ilopango in what is now El Salvador. But I'm curious how you think of that void, or what your hopes are for it as it moves, and then there is this space where it used to be at the volcano that left.
Yes, I think it's really important that you mentioned that the working of the three institutions. I think it has been so beautiful to watch. So at first, Eric said, I'm really interested in bringing this work and having the show at Storm King. I was in France, so I was only able to talk to Eric at first over Zoom. And Vic, who was at RPI, said, this sounds great for the piece, so they can open the show with the piece and then we can have it over here. But the show in Storm King ends in November 13th, and the show in Impact begins November 3rd. And I had wanted from the very beginning to bring this piece over a shipping container from Europe to the United States. And it was December. It was, you know, very difficult to achieve something like that when everything was frozen. And so it was not really possible to do. And so I thought this is the opportunity for Ilopango to actually travel in the way that we were imagining before. And so we talked about it with Eric and with Vic, and also with the folks at the Vera List, where I have the Borderlands Fellowship. And everybody came on board, and it has been really beautiful to see these three institutions working together to make it possible for what I was envisioning at first, which was the volcano migrating over a boat on the Hudson from one institution to the other one. And so that's part of what we are going to work on, and what's going to happen on October 28th and 29th. So the volcano will be deinstalled and will be installed again on top of a boat, and it will travel over the Hudson on October 28th and 29th, because we estimate that it will take about 16 hours navigating from one location to the other. I'm really interested also in the Hudson as a river that the Lenape believed sacred, that has currents that move north and south, and so was called the river that flows both ways, and that has tides, and that has a set of locks that evoke the locks in the Panama Canal because we're built by the same crew that built the Panama Canal, these locks that allow boats to hit the tide from above, and all these forces that create the tides that are made visible by the water, like the sun and its gravity, like the moon and its gravity, and like the earth and its gravity, as well as the specific density of salt water and of fresh water, competing with each other. And so all these forces that are the forces of the planet are forces that are made visible in the river. And I love the idea of then Ilopango crossing through a space where all these forces are at play and going from one location to the other. The void that it will leave at Storm King, to me, is so important because a void is a portal. It's not only a lake, but it's a portal to the underworld, but a portal also in the sense of a time machine, a portal that allows us to travel to other space-time and to imagine other things, but also a void that gives new meaning to the stela that's telling the story of this volcanic sculpture, and that's next to it. And I gotta say that Storm King, the team of people led by Mike Seaman, who care for the sculptures that are in the park, etc. They are amazing, and they built. We sent a layout, a shape, the form of the foot of the sculpture, and they built base for it that's made of wood, but that's painted in this dark blue, and it almost looks like a lake sometimes when the light hits it just so. And I think the weathering, etc., that it has endured during all these storms, etc., will also mark it. And so I think it's really powerful and important that leaving that there, leaving that possibility for us to imagine a volcano transforming itself into a lake, or a volcano transforming itself into a void or a portal to another dimension, to another world, to another temporality. It's really beautiful. And so I love that we're going to get to experience that. And for people who are not able to be there, I mean, it's going to be traveling through the Hudson, so lots of people will be there, but we also have the intention at least to transmit, have a live streaming so that people can see it from Central America and from Los Angeles and other places.
Yeah, I cannot wait to see it go on the Hudson. It's going to be such an amazing experience watching it undergo its performance on the Hudson River. It's going to be so fascinating and wonderful. I wonder, this seems like a good time to talk a little bit about the opportunity of the work being temporary at Storm King, and specifically in that context. And it's something that we talked about this earlier together. It's something that you've explored before in different locations in your work. But one of the things that struck me a lot about this work and the three works in position at Storm King was the way in which they were so beautifully and poetically linked to the context of Storm King, in the way they were placed, and the way they are placed, and the way that they respond to the sculptures around them, respond to the site and the place, and will travel in the Hudson and become this beautiful performance in that space. But they also, in their temporariness, carry this tremendous power in both their ability to move and to change and shift and tell a chronology that's bigger than one moment. And that feels like something that you've explored a lot. And I'm just curious to hear you speak about that as well, relative to the work.
Yes, yes, that's right. I mean, I am a thinker of nomadism. I want to imagine myself as a nomad, and I love to imagine the sculptures as nomads as well. Sometimes nomads because of their own transformation, sometimes nomads because they are on the move, and moving through different landscapes allows them to gain new meanings. I'm excited about seeing the sculpture crossing through the Hudson, because at that moment it will gain other meanings of moving earth, as it has happened so many times during moments when the global warming has melted the ice, and large portions of ice have moved mountains, literally. And so we see glacial erratics and land from elsewhere in lots of different landscapes, including in New York City and Central Park. We see all these glacial erratics. And so I'm really interested in that motion of land. And I think that the temporariness of a work can also be perceived as nomadism, and I see it as nomadism. There's something about modernity that is about permanence. We imagine permanence. We imagine that the institutions, the banks, Rockefeller Center, I don't know, the things we know that they're permanent, that they're unmovable, that they will always be there. And we imagine that museums will always be there. And I remember one time when I was part of the Made in LA, and we invited Claire Colebrook, who's a thinker that has really impacted my work and supported my practice in many ways. And I remember that Claire came to the Hammer and said, well, in thousands of years, the Hammer won't exist anymore. And everyone was quiet and looked at her so serious. But what she was trying to convey is that nothing is permanent, and so in other moments, I have explored this. For example, there was a piece that I installed inside Rafa Esparza's installation at the Whitney Biennial in 2017, I think it was, or if not, it was 2018. But the thing is that Rafa Esparza's installation was made of adobe and of earth, and I brought cairn, which was a marker built in the way that ancient indigenous peoples built in collaboration with the planet, with gravity, by placing rocks all pointing in different, from different sides towards the center of a marker. The gravity keeps the piece locked and in place, because one of the rocks is canceling the pull of the other one, etc. And so I was really interested when building those cairns in thinking that in modern times we build markers. We usually make them of concrete, but they kind of look like those cairns. And we say, this is the corner of my private property, or we put them every mile, and we say, this is the marker of the border between these two countries. And we imagine these markers as permanent, but indigenous peoples were more in tune with nomadism, and they were able to say, this is the marker in summer, but then we'll move it in winter where it's not raining, and then we'll move it there, blah, blah, blah. And so they didn't use concrete, they used gravity to hold things. And I think that requires mathematical formulas and a lot of technology to understand how to do that. And if we don't understand it, of course, when I have built those structures, oftentimes people think they're not safe because they don't have anything holding them that they can see, but there's nothing safer than gravity. Otherwise, we would have fallen already, right? So there's this interest in my work from the very beginning in exploring not temporariness, but nomadism, or the opposite, or to imagine the opposite of permanence, so that we can imagine long temporalities and imagine what might happen if everything is on the move, if, I don't know, if continents are rafts, if the world is on the move, if the landscape and the mountains are transforming themselves and are changing, and if sculptures are also on the move, what could happen? So permanence, to me, is really interesting, and it carries other political and spiritual content. But in the case of this work, nomadism was at the center, conceptually at the center of this piece. And also perspective, the perspective of from where do we see a constellation, from where do we see a mountain, and from what temporality, because the stela is marking the temporalities that are on the move as well. And so the motion of temporalities is also embedded in the installation, and that's really important to me because time is at the center of my work.
Yeah, and let's go to the stela because I feel like we haven't gotten to talk that much about it yet, and there's so much to talk about with the stela. This is Stela Z after Quirigua, and it is this. It's slightly higher than human height, and I love this photo of it because of the way it's standing right next to the pathway, almost becoming a pathway in and of itself. And what is on the stela? Can you tell us a bit about what the stela depicts? And then also, this stela is Stela Z. It was preceded by Stela A and Stela B, two other stelas that you made. And how did you sort of make this one coming out of those two? And how was this one unique?
Yeah, I think that for me, the stela has always been really important in terms not only of giving us information about what travels the volcano has already completed and where it is at this moment in time, but also because the stela was made at a moment when everything inscribed on it was speculative. And it was based on the plans as exact as we could, but everything was speculative. It was what I was imagining that would happen. And slowly then the stela is moving from above to below, from the future towards the past. And so the top of the stela has the eruption of Ilopango inscribed there, but also the making of Ilopango. It's in my mind, the making of Ilopango, the generating this idea, this concept, this work. And then it coming over a shipping container, crossing the Atlantic is right under that. And then eventually it gets to the port of Los Angeles, and you see the bridge at the port of Los Angeles and you see this, all the shipping containers under it. And eventually traveling by truck in LA style, of course, on the freeway to my studio, which is at Big Art Labs and Building 5. And so you can see the doorway to Building 5, how it arrived to us. And then you see it also traveling by truck to Storm King. And so in the middle of the stela, there's the installation at Storm King outside. You see the volcano, you see the stela on the left, and you see the 11 rocks that form the constellation of Orion laid in the landscape, on the landscape. But the rocks are installed at Storm King. The rocks are installed following the layout of what this constellation looks like in New York. And so it's turned a little bit from what I imagine in Los Angeles. And so it's kind of interesting that you can see that it's the same constellation, but it's turned around. And also we had not installed yet at Storm King. So you can see that the volcano is on the left and the stela is on the right. But I did it backwards when I was imagining and envisioning and willing this to happen. And then you see the volcano over a shipping container and crossing the Hudson. Right below it in this other space in the stela, and the boats were made thinking of the actual boats. This is the boat that's the fireboat that actually works as a fireboat and also has tours and has like this fountain looking days when it's turns into a fountain in this has water shows. That is the boat that is going to be carrying Ilopango over the Hudson, which is also beautiful because it's part of the Maritime Museum, and it brings the Maritime Museum also into the collaborative space of this project. And then at the bottom, you see the impact, which has a very peculiar kind of building. And so I made the building of the impact and the volcano next to it, because at first I was imagining that the volcano at the impact would be installed outside, but actually will be installed in the interior as part of an exhibition called Shifting Center. And so the bottom, I left it open because I felt that the future is open, that this stela, maybe we are seeing it up to here, but I don't know how tall it is. You know, there might be other layers of this stela under the ground, etc. And so there's also that movement of temporalities and movement of constellations and movement of land. That's all a part of that effort to portray nomadism as opposed to permanence in my exhibition. But I also love the conversations it brings, like, for example, the way that this metal looks and the conversation that it engages with Sarah Says piece, which is right down the hill. And there's several pieces that are, if you walk around Storm King, that are about rocks. There's pieces that are about mountains, motion of land. There's waves of land on the landscape, etc., but also of matter and of molecules. And there's several pieces there that engage in conversation with these. And I find that beautiful, and also something that was out of our control. And I love that, because then the works and the objects take a life of their own and begin having conversations that you didn't enable, but they enabled on their own. And that's really beautiful.
Yeah, I love that you're talking about some of the other works around this one, because to the right, which you can't see off the image, there are some ionic columns that were taken from the Don Skimmer estate that are in Mountainville at Storm King. And the columns are so interesting because, you know, they were meant to hold up this estate in a very, you know, Greek architecture kind of way. And then you have Stella, and Stella tells this. I love the way you talked through the story of the Stella. I loved the Stella. I particularly loved Building 5, which this image doesn't quite show, but you can very clearly see as Building 5 on the Stella. But there's something really beautiful about the way the story of the Stella works downward, and the way that it roots into the heart of the earth, and that the unknown exists at the base, and also the way at the time that it was made, it was completely speculative, as you said, but the way that the sculpture is alive in the way that as this future that it depicts becomes a reality, the relationship to the sculpture ultimately changes, right? As you said, like the installation gets installed, and then what is speculated about where the volcano will go relative to Cosmic Mirror, relative to the Stella, suddenly becomes the reality of what it is. And there becomes this interesting dialogue between what the Stella predicted and what actually transpired. And that will only become more so the case as the volcano travels and as the image kind of comes to life in reality and with time. And there also feels to be this acknowledgement in the lower aspect where you haven't done anything of the limitations of human lifespan, human vision, you know, what we can know, and sort of a peace with those limitations, which I feel is ongoing in your practice, sort of a peace with both an endless exploration of something bigger, a bigger timeline, a bigger chronology that is the Earth's and that is the universe's, but also a peace with the humanity of not always knowing everything or having things so spelled out. And I wondered if you felt that that was true in the work, or if you wanted to add anything to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's something really interesting about this piece. Not when it stays, it will tell, I mean, it did well into happening what happened, but at the same time, this piece will not be there to tell to document what happened with the volcano. It will not be there to inscribe the history of this volcano. It will be there to document the speculative life of this volcano, because what it documents is what I imagined and not what actually happened. And in the more inaccuracies that exist, the more that it documents the speculative life of the volcano as opposed to the historic life of the sculpture. And I love that because it leaves a testament of my speculative practice and not of history, which is so human.
So human. We're running out of time, but I do want to reflect with you a little bit on Contrary Warrior, part of the title of this work. Do you think of yourself as a contrary warrior, or your practice as such?
No, and none of the work is about me, but I thought of this Stella as a contrary warrior in many ways. On the one hand, it's moving from the future to the past and not from the past to the future. So it's questioning the idea that chronologies move in linear way from the left to the right, and that they are Darwinian, and that ancient indigenous peoples in those Darwinian drawings are backward. And this contrary warrior is saying ancient indigenous peoples were amazing scientists and amazing builders and amazing at understanding the forces of the cosmos and the forces of the planet, and at imagining abstract vision and non-human vision, etc. And so it's a contrary warrior, not for me, it's a contrary warrior. If you were a chronology, then you would be in trouble with a Stella like this. But for us, it's, an invitation to think outside chronologies, to resist chronologies and think in circular ways or long temporalities and deep time.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for answering all my questions. I know we have
beautiful questions.
We have several audience questions already, so I'm going to turn it over to Eleanor so that we can give folks a chance to ask you their questions as well. Thank you, Beatriz.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Beatriz and Chloe, for this absolutely beautiful dialogue. So much to think about, and we have gotten some great questions from the audience. So I'll start off with a question from GE, which I'll ask on his behalf. GE asks, can you talk about the importance of the performative part your sculpture can play, and how it is or isn't part of deep rituals? Thank you.
Well, I think it's really interesting to think of performance as a ritual, and also to think of a performance as something that an object can do. Definitely, I think that I really love this question. Thank you, GE, because I think for me, one of the things that I have learned from my friends who are Maya in particular, but also from ancient peoples in Mesoamerica, is that objects are alive, matter is alive, and objects have wills. And in the Popol Vuh, there's a section at the beginning of the Popol Vuh, which is the sacred book of the Maya Quiche, where the objects rebel, because objects can protect you, but objects can punish you if you mistreat them. And so there's a certain spirituality about everything we do, and objects need to be treated with respect in order for the spirituality to kick in, and for them to protect you, and for you to realize that we're smaller than objects, not bigger than objects. And so there's a certain ritual to that, I think, because this performance is being carried out by a volcano. It's not being carried out by me. I am not part of the performance. I'm not going to be on the boat with the volcano. In fact, I'm going to be probably driving around the Hudson, trying to wait for it to pass me on the river, waiting for a stop so I can go on the boat and say hello and get out. But it's really the volcanic performance and not the artist performance. And so I really like this, to play with this idea that performance is not something that is exclusively human. And also that ritual is not something that's exclusively human. And so that's really beautiful question to think about. And as it's crossing the river, it's also crossing a river. And if you imagine different temporalities, it allows us to honor the vision of ancient peoples in this space who saw and were able to understand the science behind this river, to the point that they labeled it, they named it as the river that flows both ways, because they were able to understand its currents, to know it so well as one of them, you know. And so there's something really powerful about our recognition that ancient peoples knew the earth.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Beatriz, and thank you, GE, for that really great question. Our next question is from Stephanie, and I'll give Stephanie the opportunity to unmute. Hi, Beatriz.
Hi.
It's such a pleasure to hear you talk. Like, such a pleasure. And you'll never guess that my question is about the movement of, gosh, what did I even say earlier? Speaking of movement of the earth, the movement of geology that moves, I think is something that I said. But I was wondering if you felt prepared to talk about how what you've been looking at in your Storm King project ties into what you just did in Svalbard.
Yes, Stephanie and I are part of a small group of really fortunate artists who have been part of the Arctic Circular residency in the Arctic on a boat called the Antigua, which with an amazing team of guides going into Arctic regions where there are no humans really living there, and where you're able to see the multiple temporalities of the planet and the motion of Earth, because there are places where the mountains are turning over and moving to the side. And there are places where the land, you can see that the land is moving and shaking so much that the pebbles are organized in certain ways. You can see the way in which glaciers are, you know, big chunks of glaciers that are really huge. Icebergs are falling off the front of a glacier and jumping into the ocean. And you can see the strength of the rivers and the waterfalls that are coming off all this ice. And so to me, I went to the Arctic because I wanted to look for the particles of Ilopango in a speculative way, of course, with my speculative tools and not with my scientific tools. And to me, that was really important, because I wanted to imagine the landscapes where Ilopango's particles live today, and they have been found in Arctic regions, in Antarctica, in large cities like Mexico City, in Greenland, and in Iceland, and in other places. And so I wanted to go to a landscape that was so far removed from the landscape where Ilopango came from, and to imagine the particles there. And being there, I was surprised to find, once you approach the ice, once a chunk of ice comes floating towards you, and you're in a zodiac, in a small boat floating, and you are able to pick it up, you realize that the ice is full of little bubbles of ancient atmospheres that have maybe been there for millions of years, and that you're breathing this ancient atmosphere because that's what's being released from the ice, and that potentially there's particles that have been there not only from the time when Ilopango had an eruption, but maybe way before then, and that all these things are in motion, and they're part of this nomadism, and they're part of this migration. And so Ilopango took me there, and being there, I was able to see that motion, and it was incredible. And so I think that definitely, when I remember the day when I finished Ilopango, I remember that Young Chong from Commonwealth and Council, my friend Young, said, "What are you going to do next?" And I remember thinking, I don't know how to answer that question because I feel dead. I'm so tired. I'm exhausted and I have no ideas. I am a black hole in the universe. I don't have any answer to that, you know? And then immediately I left for the Arctic, and then I came back from the Arctic and I already know what I'm doing next because I already am obsessed with so many things that I saw, and I'm sure all the artists that were there feel the same way. And so it was really an amazing experience, and I'm really grateful to Stephanie, who I only have met via email, but who gave me so much advice. That was super helpful.
You're very welcome. No, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was such a great question. Our final audience question today is from Barbara, and I'll read on Barbara's behalf. Do animals and insects inhabit the Ilopango structure? Do birds nest there? If so, do you have specific thoughts about how that non-human encounter might intertwine with the human encounter with Ilopango?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question that to me has always been really important. I remember during the Made in LA biennial, I had two structures that one installed in the Hammer and the other one was outdoors by the LA River. And I could see that it was performing for the bees and for the birds. And one time I was giving a talk about the performance, and I had, well, I had not done it. My friend Maria, who's an amazing artist, who's in the next Made in LA, Maria Garcia, she went on a crane because I'm scared of heights and I could not do it, and put a camera on top of the palm tree next to the sculptures so that we could see it. And I was in the middle of a talk and a bird, an osprey, came over and took the camera away. And so you could see that not only birds and animals are interacting with the sculptures, but the dogs would love to go and stand on this was the only shady spot sometimes of the day in that park, etc. And I feel that it's the same way here. There's birds flying everywhere all over Storm King right now. It's green, lush. There's so much, there's iso mushrooms growing on the ground, wildflowers when I was there. And so I'm sure that there's all this life that's interacting with the sculpture and enjoying its presence and maybe complaining about it as well. I don't know. We don't know their language. We don't know exactly what their critique of the work might be, but I know that definitely all the beings interact with the sculptures, and I think it's really beautiful. And so to answer your questions, how non-human encounter might intertwine with human encounter, I think it's great, to ask this question and to go there and to pay attention to the other life around. It's really a great way to approach a sculpture instead of thinking that it's only meant for us. So I think your question is really beautiful because of that.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Barbara. And thank you, Beatriz, for that beautiful, beautiful answer. And again, thank you, Chloe and Beatriz, for the amazing conversation. It's been so rich and exciting. We do have a tradition here at the Rail of concluding our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm really thrilled to welcome our Poet Laureate of the Day, Laura Jaramillo, to the stage. Laura Jaramillo is a poet and critic. Born to Colombian parents in Queens, she now lives in Durham, North Carolina. Her books include Material Girl and Making Water. She holds a PhD in critical theory from Duke University, and she co-runs the North Carolina-based reading and performance series called Paradiso. And Laura?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Chloe, and especially to Beatriz for your incredible work and an incredible conversation. And thank you to the staff of the Brooklyn Rail for organizing this. I wanted to read something that was that felt organic to the conversation. And particularly I picked up on kind of like this image of the mountains moving was very evocative for me. and my own experience of being in the mountains is of being in the Andes, in particularly above Bogota, where a lot of my family lives. And so I was going to read from my new book, but I'm going to read from my old book. And the book is called Material Girl, and it ends with a long poem called Material Girl, and this is an excerpt from it. A landscape passes before you distractedly many times, may penetrate the mind after having been a child for decades. He's been a man for weeks. High in the Andes, looking down the rolling valley of gasoline, dust, concrete, and recombinant crime, the map will show a modeled record of population spreading through some megalopolis in the Americas, between certain decades fading brown rings around burgundy circles where bodies live in closest compression, massed together tight, draw new maps with more mucus, blood mixed with smog on the brow. When we cross the threshold to rest, press our faces into the hard night. Unbroken center in the crush, the Cafeteria Romana, stately yellow in its faded modernity, soot-darkened awnings, peeling flower-spangled wallpaper, the Deco City Center cordoned off for demolition, a wave of political graffiti, a wave of surreal pictures, broken pre-Columbian icons, Nazi insignia sprayed on improbable surfaces. Captain America holds a straw to a huge pile of blow. Gaitan, commemorative mural, murdered in 1948. Waving his fists, suit taut over short arms raised, inside a frame so much smaller than him. Square mestizo jaw, taut, broken by history, frame shrunken by same. Downtown swarms with cheap-suited lawyer and secretary colonies in opaque pantyhose. Through the crush, that delivery boy rides a motorcycle in front of the central bank. Watch the spectators press their hard faces tight into any arid day. Distrust sketched mean against malice. A bride stands enclosed in her gilt case at the end of the Pasaje Jimenez, flanked by negative space, plus other mannequin companions behind tidy and proud under dust, but shoddy in comparison to the gem on the finger, the gangrenous arm of a dead arcade with watch and umbrella repair shops huddled in arches. A man is taping together ruptured cassette tape long after 5 o'clock in 1970. Fixing things becomes a form of poverty, of waiting to preside over a mass destruction. Human density slicing mountains. There's a story, progress like desire, destiny inexorable. A heron stands a little circumspect, embroiders the pond's edges, then the sky. Here in the heights, souls cleave the haze, the ancestors' immaterial substance mixed with cloud laughter, to recognize us as little as we recognize them, massed around knife pleats of light closer to the sun, gold and purple acacia, clover, eucalyptus drip, bright and mentholated, honey in the oxygen, loose and free inside the lungs. Though the meanings of freedom mix and disperse in shallow waters, tadpoles under the finger, insects caught here in insect life, our failure's sameness is pooling in blood and fiber, flesh, no fidelity, so absolute, some cipher, no one better than the other. We will never have had each other in the absolute steadfastness of fact that no one will ever have had each other is the balm, some essential substance that shrinks from naming, from obligation. The nation's wild flowers bow gently around our waists in the open, field bordered by plastic tents that house the world's carnations, and roses carnivorous, land, water, air, dissolving in velvet belly for export, invested in wilting, mutable futures. We lose our relationship to the land, then we lose the land. Cheeks and foreheads, drink the last rosy light. That's it.
Wow, thank you so, so much, Laura.
Thank you so much for having me, you guys. This was a great event.
Yeah, it was so great. It was so beautiful. Thank you so much again, Laura, and thank you again, Chloe and Beatriz. And we would also like to thank Eric and Adela from Storm King for their support in preparing for today. And thank you to the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations, as well as for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on our YouTube channel and where this conversation will be up shortly. For the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our free monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to support the Rail and join us next week for a week of screenings, beginning with Unseen Skies, directed by Yara Boob Melem and featuring the work of artist Trevor Paglin. Register on our website for a 24-hour access link on Monday. And thanks to all of you for tuning in today. You can now all turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Great to see you all, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you so
much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your reading, Laura. Thank you, Beatriz. Thanks,
Thank
Chloe.
Go see the show at Storm King if you
Yes.
are able.
Congratulations on the show, Beatriz.
Thank you so much.
I'm going next Wednesday to see
Oh,
it.
fantastic. Thank you.
Absolutely. Congratulations. And please go to see the show, you all.
Yes.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, everybody, for being here. And thank you, Beatriz, again. And thank you, Laura, for those incredible words.